Yeah, that's an interesting question. Origins can actually be traced back in Germany. As a personnel consultant, I'm sometimes asked about the, say, effectiveness as well as background or history, respectively, of assessment centres. And this, of course, is an interesting as well as, I'd say, significant question, as organisations invest a lot of energy and resources into this tool, which we as a consultancy have been refining over the last 15 or so years. So the first observable multiple assessment approach to personnel selection can be traced back to military officers recruitment in Germany, approximately around 1929 onwards. Back then, the competencies required of potential officers were defined as follows. Perseverance and determination, that was one competency they dwelt on, the creation of means to achieve a goal and the achievement of a goal, basically. Another one would be positive will, a habit of voluntary response to the command of the superior leader, strategic as well as operative thinking, of course, that is planning and executing a preconceived action. And most certainly mental stability, the ability to live up to any situation in order to achieve a goal, mathematic thinking, character, integrity, selflessness, and idealism. So these were kind of dimensions they would bear in mind and focus on. The assessors were two officers, one of whom a colonel who made the final decision, one physician, and three psychologists. The techniques employed included tests of cognitive ability, personality assessment by observation of a choice reaction test, in this case hand and foot reactions to a large series of visual and auditory stimuli, actually. A demanding obstacle course as well that required the candidate to carry out a series of complex tasks, observation of a leadership task which certainly is sort of reminiscent of the conception of a man back then, or of man back then as such, as in technocratic, resorting to directive authoritarian demeanor and behavioristic approaches. So here we have the earliest example of an organization which makes use of a multiple assessment technique with multiple assessors to measure multiple competencies. So that's the first part about the background of the assessment center. Yeah, that was the United Kingdom. Until the summer of 1942, British Army officers got selected based on a rather short and basic interview. Candidates typically came from public schools with an Army cadets force included. The decision to suggest as well as put someone forward for officer training was made completely haphazardly as well as intuitively, and the characteristics that were assessed had little to do with subsequent performance. Little to nothing, actually. It was in 1942, following pressure from the British Parliament, actually, that the Brits set up War Office Selection Boards, abbreviated WOSBs, inspired by the German approach, which had been kind of developed in the 1920s, 1929. As I just shared with you, the WSOBs include intelligence tests, psychiatric interviews, as well as a simulated command task. Lasting approximately 3 or 4 days even, these selection boards culminated in an assessment of the candidate's performance against 17 categories of competence that were perceived to be indicators of officer potential, or rather competencies as we understand it. A year later, the content of the WOSBs was tailored to the needs, was sort of modified, abandoning some of the tasks that owed much to the German model. The new process included leaderless group problem-solving exercises that required teamwork and cooperation. Individual tasks would include presentations and no fewer than 8 challenging stress interviews. The first non-military use of multiple assessment techniques was also found in the UK. Dating from 1945, approximately, the Civil Service Selection Board, abbreviated CSSB, introduced a three-phase system for recruiting middle to high-level civil servants. The second phase of this process included verbal and non-verbal tests, interviews, an examination, projective personality measures, individual exercises, including a presentation and group exercises. The assessors, in this case, two civil servants and one psychologist, would share impressions and information after the assessment center and then independently rate each candidate's competencies. This took place in the United States back in the 1950s, pioneered by AT&T Incorporated. AT&T, of course, is an American conglomerate holding company, headquartered in Whitaker Tower in downtown Dallas, Texas. AT&T is actually the world's largest multinational telecommunications company, as we all know. And AT&T actually is also the second largest provider of mobile telephone services and the largest provider of fixed telephone services in the United States. So this very company decides to use this method, assessment center method. Although the Office of Strategic Services made use of multiple assessments during the Second World War, the most pivotal development in the United States was the first assessment center procedure to be used in the private sector. The American Telephone and Telegraph Company, AT&T, in 1956 identified 25 management characteristics which were assessed via a 2-hour interview, an in-tray exercise, as we still use it today, slightly modified and refined, of course, a leaderless group discussion, a business game, a range of projective tests, as well as a cognitive test as well. From then on, the tool of assessment centers has been refined, nuanced, and elaborated, ranging from challenging scenarios to be dealt with in peer dialogues, employee discussions, strategic presentations, cognitive tests, case studies tailored to the industry in question, discussions with board members, and so forth and so on. Some additional fundamental aspects which we believe are essential when assessing potential and the maturity of competencies in people are these three perspectives which one needs to bear in mind. The question is how to learn about someone, how to explore, as it were, someone else's personality. The approaches are to ask yourself, to ask others, as in third parties, and thirdly, to ask someone to show what he or she can actually put into action, can do. So these are the three perspectives which we see in order to learn about someone else's personality. Firstly, ask questions. Secondly, ask third parties, ask others. And thirdly, and that's really where the assessment center comes in most strongly, to make people show what they can do, what they can put into action. So first, during a preferably competency-based interview, for instance, but also when reflecting simulated employee or peer discussions, presentations, leaderless group discussions, etc., one should ask questions in order to explore competencies, as in motivation, orientations, experience, and knowledge. Secondly, one is well advised to make participants actually show what they can put into action, as I told you before, right? What I mean by this is real behavior, as in how does someone resolve conflicts, what about the power of convincing others, taking decisions, analyzing complex data, presenting ideas in front of a crucial or and a critical audience, etc. Thirdly, one can take information about potential candidates into consideration by analyzing their track record, possibly also by involving points of view of their superior. 360 feedback results, information about performance in challenging projects, etc. So these different approaches will provide you with a more holistic idea of a candidate. assuming, of course, a thorough job analysis of the position for which candidates are being evaluated precedes the actual assessment center, and that proper guidelines are adhered to during its design and administration, successful challenges to the assessment center method are absolutely rare if you're asking me. Well, it goes without saying, of course, materials and exercises used in the assessment center should be directly linked to their requirements, as in competencies, which candidates are being measured against. We also think that the assessment center method is highly adaptable to all kinds of positions and assignments within modern organizations that go for a high-quality recruitment or personnel development approach. Provided that the center is designed and carried out professionally, assessment centers are eminently fair and objective. Furthermore, assessment panels should be constituted wisely and reflect gender as well as ethnic diversity, and as such are open and fair to the dynamics of diversity in the workplace. Actually, in the vast majority of cases, there is little, if any, adverse effects or impacts in an assessment center compared to more traditional written examinations and oral examinations. So, assessment centers measure what a person can put into action, not what they have accumulated knowledge-wise. It does not suffice whatsoever memorizing philosophies, models, or abstract principles. What is important, however, is the ability to actually apply formal education in a real-world situation. A person may have a college degree or high intellect, but this will be worthless as a leader or supervisor if incapable of making critical decisions under pressure, if lacking the leadership ability to get subordinates to follow his or her lead or instill a healthy environment for staff to feel comfortable, free of fear and unnecessary stresses which inhibit performance. Assessment centers are indeed challenging for both candidates as well as the assessment panel as such, but from our point of view, they remain the most valid and objective tool to measure personnel potential. The assessment center method is widely accepted and favored by candidates, as this method can be regarded as an objective and fair way of evaluating candidates for assignment or promotion. If I consider feedback I receive from attendees after assessment centers, for instance, I have people who I have encountered over the years, candidates participating, believe the process to be a good measure, a good measuring tool of their ability to do the job for which they are being considered. So assessment center insights can also be used for for a multitude of purposes. In addition to helping to make decisions about job assignments and promotions, results can be used to zoom in on organizational deficiencies, for instance, lack of cross-departmental communication, for instance, the need for new or revised procedures, like inefficiencies in structures, processes, workflows, and so forth, as well as organizational and individual training deficiencies, for instance, coaching skills as well as reporting writing skills. Their versatility makes the assessment center method a valid and useful management tool from our point of view. Clearly, it depends on how assessment centers are designed and administered, but the assessment center approach can play a pivotal role by providing feedback to candidates about their strengths and development areas, thus granting them an important insight into their abilities and skills. Videotaped as well as written feedback from assessors, which comes as a report after the assessment center as such, for instance, may be very helpful to candidates in preparing them for their individual future advancement. As a consequence, candidates receive a very tangible benefit from their participation in the process. So, we think that if it's worth doing right, and any attempt to do an assessment center on the cheap, so to speak, will probably not produce satisfactory results. So, this is, in a nutshell, what can be said about the history of the method as such, right? Develops in Germany, or invented in Germany in the first place, then kind of further develops in the UK and used in the private sector for the very first time by AT&T in the United States. And this is also what one should bear in mind when using the methods. We, as a consultancy, are very passionate about.